You know exactly why you clicked on this video. Almost everyone does it. Almost no one admits it. And almost everyone feels the same thing right after. It happens in seconds, a private moment, then a feeling that arrives almost instantly afterward. Guilt. You promise yourself this was the last time. You mean it. And somehow, days later, you're back exactly where you started. Why does this keep happening? Why does a moment of release turn into hours of shame? And why does the guilt never actually seem to stop the behavior? The answer isn't weakness. It isn't a lack of faith or willpower or character. It is something far stranger, hiding in the wiring of your brain. Let's start with the obvious question. Is masturbation actually a moral failure, a mental illness, or simply human? Most clinicians and researchers who study human sexuality agree on something surprising. Masturbation is one of the most common human behaviors on Earth. Studies going back decades, including research summarized by the Kinsey Institute, estimate that the vast majority of men and a large majority of women report masturbating at some point in their lives. Major psychiatric organizations do not classify it as a disorder on its own. So, if it's this common, why does it feel like a secret battle? Why does it come wrapped in so much shame? The answer has less to do with the act itself, and more to do with what happens right after. Picture the cycle. First, there's the urge, then the act. Then, almost instantly, the guilt arrives. You feel it in your chest, a tightening, a voice that says, you shouldn't have done that. So you make a promise. Tomorrow will be different. You mean it in that moment completely. But a few days later, the urge returns. And so does the act. And so does the guilt. Psychologists have a name for this exact loop. It's called the abstinence violation effect, first described by psychologist Alan Marlatt in his research on relapse. Here's how it works. The moment you break a rule you set for yourself, your brain doesn't just register the action. It registers a story about who you are. You don't just think, I did something. You think, I am someone who fails at this. And that thought is far more dangerous than the action itself. Because once you believe you're a failure, a strange thing happens. The behavior becomes easier to repeat, not harder. Why would that be true? Shouldn't shame make you want to stop? Here's where the story gets counterintuitive. Researcher June Tangney, who has spent decades studying shame and guilt, found something the human brain doesn't want to admit. Shame and guilt are not the same thing, and they do not produce the same results. Guilt says, I did a bad thing. Shame says, I am a bad person. Guilt can motivate repair. Shame tends to produce avoidance, secrecy, and repetition of the very behavior it's punishing you for. Think about that for a moment. The very feeling meant to stop you might be the thing quietly keeping you stuck. How does that work inside the brain? Remember the amygdala, that ancient alarm system built for physical danger. Shame activates it almost the same way fear does. Your body doesn't experience shame as a gentle nudge toward improvement. It experiences shame as a threat to your safety within the group. And what does the nervous system do when it detects a threat? It looks for the fastest way to make the discomfort stop. For many people, the fastest relief available is the very behavior that caused the shame in the first place. The same action that created the guilt becomes the shortcut out of feeling it. This is the trap, not weakness. A closed loop. Shame creates distress, the old behavior temporarily numbs distress, and relief gets quietly wired to repetition instead of away from it. Now, here's a question worth sitting with. If shame doesn't stop the behavior, why do so many people keep leaning on shame as the solution? Because it feels like it should work. It feels like punishment. It feels like taking responsibility. But research on behavior change consistently points somewhere else. Self-compassion researcher Kristen Neff has published studies showing that people who treat themselves with understanding after a setback are more likely to change long-term behavior than people who punish themselves harshly. Harsh self-judgment doesn't build discipline. It builds a hidden incentive to hide the behavior, repeat it in secret, and avoid dealing with the root cause honestly. So if guilt alone doesn't break the cycle, what does? Let's step outside psychology for a moment, because for many people, this isn't only a private struggle. It's a spiritual one. You're not just battling an urge. You're standing in front of God, again, asking for something you've already asked for many times before. So here's the real question underneath all of this. Do you deserve to be forgiven again? Or should you stop asking because you keep going back? This is where different traditions answer very differently, and it's worth hearing more than one voice. In the Christian tradition, one of the most quoted passages on this exact question comes from the Gospel of Matthew, where Peter asks Jesus how many times he should forgive someone who wrongs him repeatedly. Jesus answers, not 7 times, but 70 times 7, a phrase widely understood not as a literal number, but as a way of saying forgiveness has no ceiling. In Islamic tradition, the concept of tawbah, or repentance, is described in the Quran as a door that remains open, with numerous verses emphasizing that God's mercy is vast even for repeated wrongdoing, so long as the return to God is sincere. In Judaism, the concept of teshuvah, meaning return, is treated less as a single transaction and more as an ongoing process, one that acknowledges human beings will stumble many times on the way to change. Notice what all 3 traditions share. None of them describe forgiveness as something that runs out after a certain number of failures. The exhaustion isn't coming from a limit on forgiveness. It's coming from somewhere else entirely. Maybe the real question isn't whether you deserve forgiveness. Maybe the real question is why you keep needing to ask for the same thing over and over without the underlying pattern ever actually shifting. And that brings us back to psychology, because faith and behavior aren't separate stories. They're the same story, told in 2 languages. If shame keeps loading the gun and relief keeps pulling the trigger, then the cycle isn't a test of your worthiness. It's a mechanism, and mechanisms can be interrupted, not through more guilt. Through something almost nobody tells you to try: curiosity. The next time the urge and the aftermath arrive, try asking a different question than usual. Not, why am I so weak? Instead, what was I actually feeling right before this happened? Boredom, loneliness, stress, rejection, numbness. Researchers who study compulsive behavior patterns consistently find the same thing. The behavior is rarely about the behavior itself. It's usually a response to an emotional state the person hasn't learned to sit with in any other way. When you interrupt a cycle at the emotional trigger instead of only at the moment of guilt, something shifts. You stop fighting the symptom and start noticing the cause. This doesn't mean the struggle disappears overnight. It means the fight moves to a place where it can actually be won. So, back to the question you came here with. Do you deserve to be forgiven again? Every tradition mentioned here would answer yes, without hesitation and without keeping score. Should you stop asking? Only you can answer that. But perhaps the more useful question isn't about forgiveness at all. Perhaps it's this: what would happen if, instead of only asking to be forgiven, you also asked to understand why you keep needing to ask? Subscribe now, so next time your brain does something embarrassing at 2 a.m., at least you'll have a video ready instead of just Googling it like a criminal. Because the goal was never punishment. It was never proving you're strong enough to never fail again. The goal was always just this: to stop mistaking shame for change, and to finally treat the guilt not as a verdict on who you are, but as information about what you still need to face.